Back in 2017, a Google employee named James Damore circulated a memo that claimed, among other things, that differences in traits between men and women may partially explain why women don't represent 50% of the tech industry, and that these traits may have potential biologic causes. News articles claimed James was either a misogynist or a teller of tough truths. Which narrative they pushed largely depended on the publication's political leanings. But while James got plenty of airtime, the memo itself was neglected amongst the media hoopla. Well, 5 years later, I decided to read it, and I found that Damore's mission to explain the gender gap using biology is very misguided. Contrary to his conclusions, I discovered that the gender gap in tech is a great example of a large societal problem that can't be just chalked up to biology and ignored. Before things get real technical and serious, I want to talk about my new glasses. They're from GlassesUSA.com, the sponsor of this video. By cutting out the middleman, GlassesUSA.com offers 10,000 prescription glasses and sunglasses, including in-house brands like Muse and Amelia E, and designer brands like Ray-Ban, Oakley, Gucci, and many more at up to 70% off retail prices. 10,000 glasses and sunglasses is quite the selection, which is why they have this little quiz that asks you about your needs and your face shape, and you can find the right pair for you in around 60 seconds. Oh, and did I mention that it's the perfect place to stock up and save on contact lenses? You get 25% off all contact lens brands, including Vista Plus, AccuView, Biofinity, and many more. Shopping on GlassesUSA.com is risk-free, with free shipping and returns and a 100% money-back guarantee within 14 days. You can even virtually try on glasses before you buy. I found these glasses using their virtual try-on tool on their website. All you need to do is select an image of yourself, line up the guide with your eyes, and behold, you can now see their glasses on your face. How convenient. I found that the ones I chose look just as nice on me in person. This pair is for my everyday use. They look great, they're comfortable, and now I can finally read my teleprompter properly because they have my updated prescription in them. I also got a pair of prescription sunglasses for when I drive because they make me look like an incognito celebrity, and also because I need to see the road properly. So what are you waiting for? All you have to do is click the link in the video description below. Anyways, let's have a little chat about biology. I'm sure you've noticed that the title claims biology is irrelevant to the discussion of the gender gap in tech. I'm not a biologist or a researcher, nor do I claim to be one, but I assure you I'm well aware biology affects everything we do because we are essentially biological machines. I simply found it difficult to communicate the nuance of this topic in a 50-character YouTube title that would still be appealing to click on. I'm also aware that there are average measured differences in specific areas of personality and cognition between men and women, but what causes these average measured differences, and do they even matter when trying to explain the gender gap in tech? Personality differences are the ones James Damore points to as possible non-biased causes of the gender gap in tech. He points out average differences in men's and women's scores on personality tests, which measure a set of traits psychologists call the Big Five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. He states that these average differences can, in part, be attributed to biological causes, and that they result in women, on average, being less able to do important things, such as negotiating their salary and dealing with stress. He also claims that these personality differences may cause women to steer clear of tech jobs in the first place, out of simply being disinterested in the field. While men and women on average score differently on personality tests measuring the Big Five, the evidence supporting his bold conclusions regarding the effects of personality on women's ability or desire to navigate the world of tech is so scant that the subject of whether these personality differences have potential biological causes, which is heatedly debated by researchers, is beside the point. Let's evaluate the claim that, on average, women are less able to negotiate salary and, incidentally, less likely to ask for raises and promotions because their extroversion is more likely to be expressed as gregariousness. He also mentions that women, on average, score higher in agreeableness. This is an interesting hypothesis, but it's out of touch with the realities of how the corporate world works. In isolation, the idea that certain personality traits can be conducive to higher metrics of overall job success appears reasonable. But if certain personality traits are indeed beneficial in themselves, we'd expect the same traits to be beneficial to both men and women. Surprisingly, not all traits are equally beneficial to men and women, and some traits may even be harmful to one gender and beneficial to another. For example, agreeableness is the personality trait most strongly correlated with salary in both men and women. But whether that correlation is positive or negative depends entirely on gender. In men, agreeableness is negatively correlated with their salary, which means on average, the more agreeable you are as a man, the lower your earnings are. In fact, if a man is outright antagonistic, the opposite of being agreeable, he is rewarded pretty much regardless of his occupation with a higher salary despite being on average more combative, grandiose, and callous. The opposite is true for women who receive higher salaries on average when they're more agreeable. So I hope you understand my confusion when James Damore equates higher agreeableness with having a harder time negotiating salary. If a woman with high agreeableness had a harder time negotiating salary, then why do they earn so much more than women with low agreeableness? Perhaps these qualities of higher average gregariousness and agreeableness may be associated with being less likely to ask for raises, speak up, or get into leadership positions. And there is some evidence that, on average, workers who are more gregarious get paid less. I've already established that workers who are more agreeable get paid more on average, but only if they're women. I couldn't find strong and abundant evidence of a link between these two personality traits in women specifically and average frequency of asking for promotions or higher wages. I did, however, discover that on average, when women request payment, they ask for lower wages than men. So what may cause this? I stumbled across an interesting book titled Women Don't Ask by Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashover. One of the core premises of the book is that often women avoid negotiation because many consider it to be a male role. This idea that social expectations of how women are supposed to behave could significantly affect average traits and behavior is fascinating. There is a concept in social psychology known as stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a situation where an individual is at risk of looking like a stereotype of their race, gender, or ethnicity if they do a certain thing. Studies indicate that this phenomenon could very well have an effect on some women when they're negotiating salary or a promotion. A woman sitting with her boss may potentially be afraid to speak up because she doesn't want to look like the stereotype of an aggressive, overbearing, nasty woman. Not only may this reduce a woman's likelihood for asking for a raise or a promotion, but the situation illustrates how there are many factors unrelated to personality at play, like stereotype threat, and that these potentially make navigating jobs more stressful for women on average. Speaking of stress, James Damore attributes the higher average levels of stress women self-report on internal employee surveys at Google to women being more neurotic than men on average. Not only does he not provide a single shard of evidence to back up that claim, but the claim ignores pretty obvious potential causes of women's stress at Google. James seems like he is not picking up on the irony many find in his claims. That irony was not lost on the media, however, and journalists eagerly pointed out that constantly bracing for the impact of memos from male coworkers that imply you may be a biologically inferior diversity hire can be pretty stressful. Those journalists may be onto something, as women may simply experience more stress at Google because it's tough being a woman in tech. To be honest, the horror stories told by women in the field may even cause some women to steer clear of the field entirely, despite being perfectly capable of and interested in doing technical work. While that's my best guess why only 18% of women major in computer science here in the US, James Damore has other ideas. He states that women may choose fields other than tech because they're more interested in people rather than things on average. He corroborates that claim by citing a study that establishes this to be consistent over cultures and over time, and therefore there might be possible biologic influences involved. This study is widely cited, even by papers explaining gender gaps in STEM fields. Women, on average, absolutely do display more people-oriented goals when choosing their careers. While this tendency may be in part cross-cultural and stable over time. What is neither stable over time nor cross-cultural are massive gender gaps in undergraduate computer science programs. Remember how I said 18% of women major in computer science in the US? That figure was 27% in 1997. I'm sure James Damore would probably attribute this to the innate biological differences between men and women simply becoming more evident as women gain rights and our society becomes more egalitarian, just like one paper he cited seems to claim on first glance. I don't understand how this simple conclusion, or even the really complicated conclusions that the paper he cited actually makes, even apply here. Women in the US had more federally protected rights in 1997 than they do now. There's gotta be a different explanation. The biologic influences angle seems even less likely to be pertinent to gender gaps in apparent interest in tech because there are countries, such as Malaysia, where the percentage of women majoring in computer science has been greater than 50%. So what is the factor we're overlooking here that has such a huge impact on the gender gap in tech? The fact is that in Malaysia, computer science and IT fields aren't gendered. Suppose you were to ask a group of male and female computer science students at a Malaysian university whether or not they thought people of a specific gender were better at using computers. You'd most likely find, as one study did, that the students would not report either gender to be significantly better than the other at using computers on average. The fact that computer skills in the US are strongly associated with men may, on average, impact women's choices to pursue degrees in the field. Other skills required to get a computer science degree are also associated with men, most notably math. Considering that most undergraduate level computer science courses have very demanding math requirements, I'm quite shocked that James Damore doesn't mention average measured differences in scores on standardized math tests as a potential factor for why there are fewer women than men in computer science. That's because unlike certain measured average differences in men's and women's scores on personality tests, which may be relatively consistent cross-culturally and relatively consistent over time, measured average differences in scores on standardized math tests are far less cross-cultural and consistent, which may indicate that major societal forces are at play here. Researchers widely cite socialization as a possible factor for why we see gaps between boys' and girls' scores on standardized math tests. So how may girls be in part socialized to perform worse in math? My useless gender studies textbook that will never teach me information that will get me a real job, Gender, by Lisa Wade and Myra Ferree, gives the quintessential example of Mattel's 1992 Teen Talk Barbie, which was programmed to say phrases including, "Math class, it's tough." Math class is tough. It's not hard to understand why giving girls little plastic versions of adult women who struggle with math may teach them certain expectations about subjects in which they're not supposed to excel. Perhaps the gender studies textbook is onto something, as it points out women simply having the idea in their heads that girls are on average worse at math than men can potentially lower their average scores on standardized math tests. Studies that attempt to measure this possible effect often use a trick called priming, when researchers introduce a stereotype right before their subjects take a test. Through statistical methods, they can determine the predictive power of having stereotypes on your mind in relation to things such as scores on standardized math tests, as many studies have done. Their results appear to indicate that we'd be fooling ourselves if we said that stereotypes had no bearing on women's average scores on standardized math tests. As Wade and Ferree point out, the pervasiveness of stereotypes about girls being worse at math on a country-by-country basis is correlated with gaps between boys' and girls' scores on standardized math tests. Many countries with high levels of gender equality see significant reductions in the average differences between these scores. In Iceland, girls even perform better than boys on standardized math tests. But why is that not true for any other country? That's something they don't teach you in Gender Studies 101. The general trend here, which indicates that as indices of gender equality go up, gaps in standardized testing scores go down, appears pretty uncomplicated. But why Iceland is an outlier is due to very complicated reasons that are beyond the scope of this video. What I have found is that Iceland, though an outlier, is a great case study in why it can be misleading to depend on simply looking at average countrywide differences in test scores to explain the world around us. Just a few differences in the environment that girls and boys are raised in, or rather schooled in, which appears to be the case in Iceland, have the potential to turn the most commonly cited data we have on gender gaps in math performance upside down and backward. The cross-cultural differences in performance on standardized math tests seem to be of no concern to many who simply point to the fact that overall differences in performance on the SAT math section between boys and girls haven't really changed that much. These overall average differences, as fairly consistent as they may be, mask significant changes over time at the very top of the distribution, or the 99th percentile, where boys outnumber girls by 3 to 1. This is a pretty big performance gap, but it's comparatively tiny to what it was in the 1980s, when boys outnumber girls in the top 1% of scorers by 13 to 1. Perhaps that gender gap isn't so set in stone after all. With all this talk of SAT scores, it's essential to stop and think about whether or not SAT scores actually matter when it comes to the gender gap in tech. While your SAT math score may indeed have some impact on whether or not you'll get accepted into a prestigious school, it's more difficult to find correlations between it and your ability to get a job in computer science. It's difficult because employers are not generally evaluating candidates based on their SAT scores, unlike colleges. Ideally, employers are looking for people who excel in their fields. I know differences in SAT math scores can be decent statistical predictors of some aspects of aptitude for computer science, but studies have found that your college GPA has significantly more predictive power. Speaking of college GPA, the average GPAs of men and women in computer science programs do not differ much. If they were chasmic, you'd expect to see a statistically significant difference in self-reported GPAs between men and women in undergraduate computer science programs, even in a study with a pretty small sample size. But you don't see these statistically significant differences in those studies. I'm aware that the lack of a measurable difference between the average GPAs of computer science majors of different genders may be due to the sample of the general population we're studying, but we aren't privy to the average GPAs of women and men in a hypothetical world where the entire general population was forced to take computer science at a college level. Even with these kinds of studies, small sample sizes, and potential issues with sampling, that doesn't mean that their discoveries have been useless. In fact, a finding of one study that I found that may be very consequential is that both men and women incorrectly believe that men in computer science have much higher GPAs than women. These stereotypes, along with many other societal factors, may greatly reduce the likelihood of women pursuing computer science. On the topic of average differences in test scores between men and women, let's talk about men's and women's average scores on tests of visual-spatial ability. Men's overrepresentation in the field of computer science has been attributed to their higher average scores on these tests, which usually seek to measure visual-spatial ability by seeing if a subject can correctly manipulate arbitrary or relatively common shapes presented to them in their head. Some researchers claim these average differences appear to be relatively stable and somewhat cross-cultural. Other researchers are keen to point out that the data are hardly consistent across the board. This is why there isn't much in the way of consensus among researchers about what actually causes these differences. It's important to note that the size of the differences and which gender scores higher on these tests on average depends on which specific visual-spatial ability you're measuring. Some meta-studies have documented that gaps in some areas of visual-spatial ability are shrinking over time. Other studies have found that some gender gaps in scores measuring performance at doing specific tasks can be close to statistical insignificance with just a little training influencing the results. Essentially, when allowed to practice the particular skills required to take the tests, or doing other tasks such as playing FPS video games before being evaluated, measured gender gaps in areas of visual-spatial ability can shrink tremendously in certain instances. There is, of course, evidence that scores on tests of visual-spatial ability can have predictive power in determining success in STEM fields, including computer science. Scores on certain tests of visual-spatial ability are part of a constellation of test scores that, together, can be a pretty good predictor of, For instance, the likelihood that an individual may complete an advanced degree in computer science. This has been well established by a massive longitudinal study that followed high school students for more than 11 years. However, if you thought these test scores had incredible significance and tried to calculate, rather crudely, the theoretical ratio of women to men in computer science doctoral programs, you'll notice that this crude ratio, just based on average scores on these tests, would indicate that women are still woefully unrepresented in these programs, even though that ratio wouldn't be 1-to-1. Researchers have attributed the fact that the crudely calculated theoretical ratio from that study would still have a gender gap is likely, in part, explained by the longitudinal study's reliance on math scores. The study was conducted only in the US, and, as I've explained, gender gaps in scores on standardized math tests vary greatly cross-culturally, and the US really hasn't closed the gap as much as other countries have. I hope I have established that the gender gap in tech is not mandated by biology in any shape or form. It doesn't have to exist and pretty much doesn't exist in some countries, and there are many causes of the gender gap that could respond well to mitigation efforts. Unfortunately, we are forever distracted by the futile quest to determine the degree to which immutable and inherent biological factors cause our deeply prejudiced society to exist in the way it does. This quest has a dark history, and it would be careless to ignore the effects that the pseudoscientific research of the past have on the kind of answers we're expecting to hear. While I love science and knowing more about the world, I question the impact that future scientific studies may have on the discussion of this topic. People will always crave the satisfactory answers of quick and easily digestible pseudoscience over nuanced and truthful answers that are less satisfying. And having a wider body of research on the gender gap in tech may simply just give bad actors more studies and data to misrepresent. Ultimately, science is ill-equipped to appease certain people's deep longing to declare the gender gap in tech a product of human nature so they can just ignore it. Anyways, I'm Robert Tolpe, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd like to once again thank GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring it, and remind you to go click the link in the description below. Although this is hardly a perfectly crafted video essay, I've listed some of the main papers and books that were very useful and influential when writing this script and finding general information on the subject. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye!